Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Future of Sales. I'm your host, Sahil Mansouri, co-founder and CEO of Bravado. And with me today is a good buddy, a fellow Warriors fan who's sweating out the series, Eric Martin. As of recently promoted, Eric Martin, Senior Account Executive at DataFox. Congratulations and welcome to The Future of Sales, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. Looking forward to this, and happy to talk shop.
Yeah, there you go. So I guess, our story has kind of a unique beginning in the sense that it's one of the few examples of people meeting using social media that isn't like someone just like emailing the shit out of someone or whatever. But we actually met through social media, if I remember correctly. And I got to hear your background in sales, and maybe you can share that story because I think it's a fun one.
Yeah, it was definitely via Twitter. That story. It was via Twitter. Was it during SaaStr?
It was during SaaStr. That's right.
SaaStr, yeah. And I had a friend who was using this, and I was like, dude, I had that idea at one point. I was like, I want to sign up for that. I can't remember who it was who was using Bravado or had told me about it, but thank you to whoever that was. But yeah, in any case, like, what was your question? It was like, tell me like kind of how I got into sales.
How you got into sales? Well, your story of how you actually ended up in sales is fairly unique, given where you started out, because you didn't start out on the sales side.
True. So let's see. I'll give the real bullet point kind of narrative over the past 8 years here. So undergrad, UC Santa Barbara, in mechanical engineering. Then I went to Saudi Arabia for grad school for 3 years for a master's program in environmental engineering. That was at a school called KAUST. That's short for the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. It's a bit of a mouthful. I was there for 3 years, first year and a half doing a master's degree, second year and a half helping to set up the school's entrepreneurship center, their seed fund, their accelerator, which is actually still going very strong today, which I'm quite proud of. Nice. From there, moved back to the States, co-founded and founded 2 other startups of my own. One was in underwater hardware. One was in, let's call it the fantasy sports space. Learned a lot through both experiences. Neither of them panned out. Eventually, I guess along the way, a number of my advisors and investors had told me like, hey, dude, like every good CEO needs to be a good salesperson. You're such a people person. You ought to go get some at-bats. And so I did a short stint as a product manager immediately after my second company, before deciding to jump off a ledge and just kind of go for it. And so I did. And so about 3 years ago, I took my first sales job as a BDR at a company called SwiftType, which has since been acquired by Elastic. And I've been at DataFox now for almost 2 years. The one thing I'll say before I let you ask another question is that I actually met the DataFox guys by first guest playing on their company soccer team. And so for anyone listening out there, the best way to vet a new company by far is going to battle with them 8 weeks in a row on the soccer pitch. It was great. I think at the time, our CEO, the entire sales team, 2 other co-founders were playing. So yeah, I've been here 2 years, and so far so good.
That's awesome. So what was that journey like for you? I mean, obviously you spent so much energy and effort studying on the engineering side. And, obviously as an engineer, as a product manager, and to go from that side of the house to the sales side, to talk me through what that felt like. I mean, what was your perception of sales as you were going into it? Did you think that this was something that you would ever end up doing in your career? I'm super interested to hear that.
Yeah, good question. So I never, ever saw myself doing sales. I was born and raised in a household where my dad is still a dean of engineering at a university here in California. And it was just kind of ingrained from day one as like, oh, like you're going to be an engineer. I can't say that I necessarily looked down on salespeople. I just knew from a distance that all of my friends from college who were doing sales studied things like art history or, just something that like, I didn't necessarily, I couldn't draw a clear line from that to the profession they had now. Mm-hmm. I respected those people, these friends of mine, but I had very little empathy in terms of like what it meant to do what they did. Mm-hmm. And so, I suppose like, going into it, It's actually one of my regrets now is that when I made that transition, that I didn't have more conversations with friends who were in sales beforehand to get a better sense for not only what the roles entail, but what the roles are, right? I had very little idea of the difference between an SDR and then a BDR and an AE. And I had never even heard of sales operations. It's funny, I now run this sales operations meetup group in the Bay Area. I didn't even know that was a profession until I joined DataFox. Yeah, I guess like the short story is that, it was ultimately, it was like taking a big piece of humble pie, making the switch from engineering, co-founder, product into sales.
So has your experience as either a PM or as an engineer helped you be a better salesperson? I mean, one of the things that struck me is, I got the opportunity to, at SaaStr, hear you pitch DataFox. And, I worked in a similar space at Sales Predict, so I know my way around some of the same technology and tools. And I was struck by, obviously it's clear that you're very good at your job and like, what you're doing, but more than that, I was struck by how clear and how articulate and how technically savvy your pitch was, compared to what I hear from a lot of other sales presentations, which seem a lot more cookie cutter and scripted. Do you think your experience as a PM, as an engineer, helped you be a better salesperson? Would you think that in the future, there'll be more of that like crossover between the two, or where's your head at around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my experience on the technical side of the house has helped me to more quickly understand like the products that I've since sold. So like whether it was site search and or, our prospecting suite here at DataFox, whether we're selling platform or API access, I'm probably the only person on our sales team who has actually like built multiple APIs before or like overseen the building of those. And so to a certain extent, I think it's helped me just be able to communicate more articulately, or if that's even the right word, more clearly, what is it we do? Because I think in that product role, right, you're effectively like translating what one team wants to a team that's just meant to build, to like bring that vision to life. And so maybe I hadn't really thought of that before, but maybe that playing that middleman role of a PM did in fact help. I just generally think that, having the technical background, while I'm not, doing any kind of thermodynamics in this role, it's rare that that like I am selling to a business that I don't have at least some baseline understanding of what it is that they're doing and how they're doing it.
Got it. Yeah. And I think, we talk a lot about earning the right to do discovery and being able to say things like, I was doing some research on your business, and you're able to do that on a very different level, I think, than what the average salesperson is when you're like actually looking, potentially at that company's code base, and you're like being able to understand like what they actually build and what they actually do. And then being able to tie that into the front end. Kind of a different question for you. Now that you've been in the role for 3 years, but you've seen a different part of it, what do you think is the hardest part of sales?
Mentally, the hardest part of sales is for sure, at least in my limited time doing this, for sure the outbound, let's call it SDR, BDR, ADR, whatever you want to call it, doing that prospecting. Man, like I remember vividly when I first got into that role at SwiftType, like the biggest learning curve for me was for sure appreciating the fact that, in order to advance in this career, you need to hit your quota. For me, that was like such a weird concept. I was like, well, I'm used to the world of like, all right, well, hey, there are delays. And so we're going to like push back the product launch by 2 weeks, and that's fine. Right. And I was like, no, like you have to do this. And so it took me a couple months to really appreciate that. A couple months, and actually just some badgering of close friends who were like, dude, why aren't you hitting quota? I'm like, like that's something we have to do. So I truly, like, I have so much respect for the SDRs who are out there just pounding the phones and hustling. And and so I'm grateful for having been in that role for almost a year and a half. And yeah, to answer your question, I feel like so far I would say that's for sure the hardest part.
Interesting. What of that job makes it so difficult? And I think, there's a very easy part of the recognition that I have never gotten a cold call and been happy about it. Right? Like I can't tell you of an instance where somebody cold called me, I picked up the phone, typically because they use some sort of an area code masking thing. So it's like, it looks and feels as if it's something local. I pick up the phone, and I get cold called all the time. And I pick up the phone and it's a cold call and I'm like, oh, thank goodness, like that's never the reaction, right?
Wait, but can I share that that's happened to me one time?
Okay. Tell me more.
And I got to give a shout out to, if she ever listens to this, Michelle from Sigster.
Okay.
So at the time, they're a very happy DataFox customer, but at the time I was BDR's year and some change ago, and I had been prospecting into Michelle and the whole org there. And thanks to these modern sales tools, you can see when people are opening and clicking emails. Mm-hmm. And clearly everything that I was sending, she was opening a lot and clicking a lot. And so I acknowledged that in my follow-up emails. And it was funny, every time I acknowledged it, it was getting more opens, etc. And so then finally, one day I call her and I'm like, hey, this is Eric from DataFox. I swear to God, she goes, oh my God, I've been waiting for your call. And I'm like, well, you're totally messing with me. She's like, no, I've been sharing all your emails with my SDRs, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wow, okay, this is too weird to be real. But in any case, she and I still joke about that. So just to emphasize, that's only happened once. I don't ever expect that to happen again. To your point, yes, more often than not, you're never looking forward to a cold call.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, that's an amazing story. And there's something really interesting about that, right? Which is that you almost built a relationship through one-way communication, which doesn't happen all that often, right? It usually takes two to tango. But I'm curious if you remember, what do you think of the emails was it that was catching her attention? Because it seems like you were personally crafting each one, and it seems like you were almost kind of building a little bit of rapport through not building rapport in like a weird way, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably just like the basics, right? We do a lot of training over here on kind of like, let's call it personas training. So we have a pretty good like grasp on what it is that everyone who we might sell to does on a or might do on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis. Mm-hmm. And we know that what we offer, they're going to be spending some time on at some point throughout the year. Mm-hmm. And so it was probably just a combination of addressing projects that I suspected she and the team may be working on at the moment. We may have had intel that they were using a competitive tool, and I think generally another tactic that works, it has to work for literally every single sales rep, is probably referencing one of their competitors. So I can't remember exactly what it was, but I guarantee it was some combination of those three things.
Well, so, and I think that, as we think more about building a relationship with buyers and building reputation kind of as a salesperson, one of the first things you said to me when we met was, you're like, I had this idea. And I think that's, and it's funny, you're the second person who said that to me. We had another guest on a while back, a guy named Dalius, who's a VP of sales at a company called GetAccept. He used to work at Trust Radius. So he had been exposed to the world of reviews in a B2B sense and whatnot. And maybe you can share your part of that story, because I found that really interesting.
My part of
what the idea was, or what you were noodling on or whatnot.
Oh yeah. So I was brand new to sales at the time, and actually I was not really. I was actually just brand new to the AE role, and I was thinking to myself, I was like, I wish there was some way where I almost wanted to create a digital portfolio of all of the businesses who I had sold to. Mm-hmm. And whether or not it was public didn't really matter to me at the time. I was just like, through all these experiences that I'm getting, whether it's a SwiftType, now DataFox, the next place, I'm given the opportunity to establish relationships and sell to any number of not just people, but also logos. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was almost, it sounds kind of tacky, but it was almost more of like a trophy case where I was just like, hey, something to look at and kind of be proud of.
Uh-huh.
So.
It's so interesting that you say that, because that's actually what we designed our client wall to resemble, is a trophy case. It's like a place where you can go and hold up the achievements that you've had as a salesperson. I'm curious about your thoughts on whether that sort of content would be helpful to a buyer when they're looking to make a decision about working with a salesperson. Because I understand from like a personal motivation, there's a great delight in being able to hold up one's achievements. But do you think there's a practical kind of use case for something like this as well, or not as much?
Yeah, I think so for sure. It's one of those things, right, where like I use Bravado is just built into my email signature. And every so often I will change the logos. Like, right, I believe, at least on my plan, I'm allowed 4 logos. Not that I would necessarily want more, but I'm allowed 4 logos. And I'll adjust those logos every so often. I try to be thoughtful about the logos that I use. Just, in the hopes that they do catch the eye of whoever I'm sending an email to. I also am known for just sending like historically like very kind of shorter emails, like short and to the point. So hopefully increasing the odds of them getting to the end and maybe seeing that signature. The Bravado use case reminds me, I see it like a lot of analogies with G2 Crowd, right? Except people are like, they're practically going to G2 Crowd to do their homework on like researching different vendors. I see some, like I said, some similarities with like them clicking into Bravado. And then once they're there, like then taking the time to actually do some research on me, the seller. It's interesting. And let me ask you this. Have you with Bravado, are you guys trying to design a platform that encourages people to that encourages shoppers to go to, or is that, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that the first use case that we want to solve for is the fact that anytime you have a meeting with somebody, you typically do a little research on them. Right, that's kind of the de facto thing that we all do, is we do a little bit of research. And the vast majority of the time, if I was to type in Eric Martin, DataFox, or Sahil Mansouri, Bravado, odds are really, really good that the first thing that's going to come up is your LinkedIn profile, right? And I think that LinkedIn has a really powerful use case if you're looking at it from the perspective of recruiting, right? Because it's got where you went to school, your past career, experience, your number of years that you've worked, and companies you've been at, et cetera. Where I've always been curious on the LinkedIn side, though, is if I'm a buyer and if I'm coming to research a salesperson that I'm going to meet with, which, by the way, and I spent 3 years in product and, away from the sales, every salesperson I ever had a meeting with, I did research on, because you just always do a little bit of research. And I've talked to, hundreds of buyers about it, and they agree. You always do a little bit of research, because it's just weird to show up to a meeting and have no idea who the person is on the other end of the line. It's just a little uncomfortable, right? At least for your own sanity.
Even as the buyer, like you want to research.
Of course, because I'm going to spend 30 minutes, an hour with this person. I want to at least know who they are. Like, if at the very least, because we as human beings are so curious, and we're social by nature too. And so if there's if you're going to meet somebody, regardless of what sort of position they're in or what value they may or may not create, just for the sake of not showing up like a jackass and not having any idea who this person is or what they do, you just want to do a little bit of research to get familiar with them. And so the thing that we thought was, what a great opportunity for the salesperson to get a little sales in, right? Like, we can help you, build a little bit of trust with that buyer, or help you get like a little bit of extra kind of credibility walking into that conversation. Like, oh wow, Eric's closed all these cool accounts, or oh wow, Eric has a customer quote from somebody that I actually know, and maybe I'll just ping that person after. And like, it just gets the juices flowing in a good direction, right? And that's all the purpose of the product is it's just like, sales is hard, and there's a number of factors that thousands of factors that are well outside of my control or your control as to whether a deal happens or doesn't happen. But one of the things that is in our control is do we establish credibility and trust with the buyer? That's something that typically we salespeople have much more control over than like, do they have the budget or do they have the business need, right? We can't control those variables, but we can control the variable of, does the person across from me think I have their best interest in mind? Do they believe me when I say something? Do they trust me? Do they care about my advice? And one of the things that I think builds credibility the fastest is social proof, right? I mean, there's a reason why people buy tickets to go see a performer that they maybe don't even know very well, but they hear that, oh, this performer must be really awesome because I've heard that they do really well. And so like you kind of follow, and we all have a little bit of that in us. And so if we can just help trigger that emotion, then maybe it'll lead to something good. All
right. So you're probably already building this in your roadmap, but if not, I'm taking credit for this. Everyone is a witness. So more often than not, as an inside sales team, our ADRs are sourcing the meetings, having a qual call, and then like passing the baton. And that first touch point where I am being introduced is actually in that calendar invitation. And so, and so typically what's happening is that like when someone passes the baton, I'm not going to send them a message until we actually connect for the call. So that first touch point is like, hey, what's up? Like, well, whatever. Interesting opportunity for Bravado, just like when you're creating a calendar invite and you can add a Zoom or a GoToMeeting link for like my ADRs to add like my Bravado link. So then what happens is more often than not, when they make that introduction in the description of the calendar invite, they say, hey, like as promised, like including my colleague Eric on this deal, he's, does X, Y, and Z. There's almost an opportunity to say like, want to learn more about him, click here.
I love it. I love that. So we are actually seeing that use case. You call it kind of the handoff use case, right? We actually just had a bunch of customer success people join Bravado from a number of companies. And so what they're doing is they're building out their profiles as well. And so when the salesperson is done closing the deal, you always introduce them to their account manager. And then that account manager, as a buyer, you're always like, I really like Eric. I hope I don't get stuck with some schmuck now, right? Like as a buyer, there's always that fear that the person who's going to service me is going to be not as awesome as the salesperson who I just bought from. Yeah. And so that person needs to now like rebuild trust with the buyer. And so they're basically using it as a handoff. We've had sales teams that just include it in their email cadence. So like when the SDR sends, connects the AE, they'll like include a link to it. But I haven't thought about putting it into the actual calendar invite. That's really interesting, actually. It's a cool.
I don't know. Just idea. Put it on the old product hat there for a second.
I
love the idea of CS, by the way, because I have to make 2 of those baton passes today, and so I was like, that would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, because as soon as you make the baton pass, that person now is kind of got the spotlight on them in order to make sure that they're living up to the expectation. And so we feel like that's one of the use cases that is, fairly, and it wasn't our use case. We didn't design the product to do this. Of course, as always, your users know your product better than you do. It was one of our sellers, a gal named Preeti, who actually and introduced and basically one day a bunch of customer success people from Uberflip just showed up on our platform, and now it's kind of a thing. And now we have a bunch of CS teams that are on it. So it's
I'm going to get ours on this after this call.
There you go. Perfect. And so lastly, I want to wrap up our call because this, dude, I could talk to you forever. I love chatting.
All right.
This is always fun. One of the things that I'd love to get your read on, we've had this conversation in bits and pieces, is that the profession of sales is just evolving tremendously. Once upon a time, buyers had very little information. Salespeople had all the information. So you had to talk to a salesperson in order to get the information. And that information could have been, what does the product actually do? What does it integrate with? How much does it cost? All of these things. Now that information is becoming more and more transparent, like you can basically Google anything and get your hands on roughly the answer to most of these questions. So So then the role of the salesperson has evolved, right? Because now I'm not needed to give you that information. You already have it before you even come and talk to me. So if you look at yourself as a salesman, congrats on the promotion again. Now you're digging into the role. What are you doing to set yourself up for success over the course of the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months as our profession continues to evolve? What are the things that matter most to a seller today?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to answer this in two parts. For me personally, I've always been a big fan of improv acting, and so that's my form of professional development. So I continue to do that. The other thing that I just swear by as like something that like really helps me out is it's not just being curious, it's having like a genuine curiosity. You know, it's going in and sometimes it's not necessarily the questions you ask, but like how you ask them. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's just kind of like one of our values here at DataFox is constant learning. I look at every opportunity, every conversation that I have as an opportunity to learn more about their business selfishly, you know, mm-hmm. And we'll get into the weeds of it, not just how their sales work is set up, but like what their product does, who they cater to, how the company's doing, et cetera. And that's one of the reasons I actually really love working at DataFox is because we get to sell to these like ambitious and or, you know, fast growing sales and marketing teams. So in terms of actual training that I'm doing or things that I'm considering, you know, I think it's the improv. I'm an avid reader. I'm also just very much like a yes person. I think being involved in these sales ops meetups have been tremendously helpful. In just not just expanding the network, but just having a better pulse on kind of like directions that things are going. I will say to your point of kind of like buyers coming in the door now with a lot more knowledge. I also 100% agree with that. I think it's an opportunity for inside sales teams. You know, here at DataFox, for example, our current setup is such that we're able to leverage, you know, marketing automation tools with our own transparent account scoring, which is based on not only companies' firmographics and maybe our Salesforce data, but also dynamic data. So things happening in those accounts to surface these best fit accounts to our sales team. We've had some customers combine the two with our API to actually automate outbound cadences to specific contacts at specific accounts based on the combination of their like marketing and account scores via DataFox. Wow. And so really interesting. The next kind of chapter that we're looking at here internally or exploring is then combining not just the marketing automation stuff, the DataFox account scoring, but also the G2 Crowd intent data. And so I am bullishly super excited if we end up, you know, figuring that out. How that'll help just from both an inbound and outbound efficiency standpoint.
It makes so much sense. You know, I think that G2 Crowd is an incredibly powerful platform. You know, I worked at Glassdoor with Clay Bentley and Olivier and many of the folks who actually are at G2 Crowd now. Nice. And we've all been friends for a number of years. And I think, you know, one of the things that we saw is that the power of crowdsourced reviews is really big. And there's a lot of value there. No, I'm a huge fan of what they're doing for sure. So
at the end of the day, like you said, man, you know, even sometimes when I'm buying a plane ticket, like there's some specific question that I wish I could talk to a human to ask. And so while I agree that there may be a like diminishing role for the people part, I think that it's, you know, having educated, respectful, considerate human beings on the other end will forever be an asset to a company.
Totally. I mean, 1,000%. Like you talk about plane tickets, right? Like you're totally right. You know, if I'm just booking a flight from San Francisco to New York and it's like a standard thing, I just book it, right? But if I'm booking a vacation to a country I don't know very well, or if I need to do like a little multi-stop thing or whatever, I know I can figure it out on the website. But it's just so much more reassuring to talk to someone and be like, am I doing this right? Like, am I, you know, there's just uncertainty. It's because I don't book complex airfare every day. You know, it's not my job. And so when you're talking to a prospect at DataFox, I mean, their job isn't to spend all day doing account scoring, right? They don't do that all day. Nobody can be a specialist in everything all the time. And so having someone who's got deep verticalized knowledge in a specific area that you're focused on is always going going to be of value as long as that person actually has deep value, right? And has deep knowledge. And if you don't have that and all you're doing is reading a script, then I think you're in trouble. I love the improv part, by the way. That's gotta be our next future sales show is you in character. That sounds like a blast.
It's funny when you take these improv classes. I'll give a shout out to Bats Improv here in SF. The first class is kind of like an AA meeting. Not that I've been to one, but based on what you see in the movies, where everyone goes around the class and they say their name and everyone repeats their name, like, "Hey, Eric," and then you say why you're in the class. And I remember in the last one that I did, everyone's giving their reasons, and then it gets to me, and they're like, "And why are you taking this class?" I'm like, "Well, for me, this is just I'm in sales. This is my professional development stipend, so here I am."
That's amazing. And by the way, I cannot stress enough how much something like improv can be so valuable for somebody in sales. I personally did drama for a number of years as well and really enjoyed it. And those characteristics of being able to kind of summon the right self at the right moment is really valuable. And I think thinking of it as personal development is a really smart way of looking at it. So, but plus it's a pretty fun way to spend an evening as well.
Oh yeah, it's super fun. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time. One last question. If anyone's got any follow-up questions or wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, it's just email. I'm pretty diligent about responding to emails. So Eric, ERIC @datafox.com.
Awesome. Eric, thank you so much for the time, man. Such a pleasure to jam out. So many topics that we got into, and we'll do this again soon. Thanks for the time.
Awesome. Thanks, brother. Talk to you later.
Bye.